And that takes us to the FBI and the function of the FBI, which, as any of you who grew up watching Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. be inspector, whatever his name was, on the FBI on TV, you understand to be the preeminent law enforcement agency, the federal law enforcement agency in the United States, the preeminent investigative agency, having to do with the rule of law, catching criminals, amassing evidence, providing it to prosecutors, furthering the due process and prosecution of those who are guilty of violations, and seeing to it that they get their just deserts, that they serve prison sentences or whatever. That's the myth. And the myth predates the FBI TV series. It runs back virtually to the inception of the Bureau. But we need to interrogate that. If I were to ask any of you to give me a self-definition, you'd probably announce something fairly positive. If I asked the person sitting next to you if they knew you, and if they knew you weren't going to be aware of the response, they might tell me something a little bit different, more candid about you. You cannot rely on any institution or agency to define itself for the public mind in any sort of accurate or candid fashion. It doesn't have to be the FBI for that to be true. And yet all that we know in the public consciousness, or by and large all it is known, is a product of the FBI's propaganda mills, situated originally in the basement of the Justice Department, more recently in the basis of the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building. And there's been precious little external intervention, acquisition of knowledge to paint a different portrait of that particular agency. But we do have a little window at which we can sort of examine the relative degree of accuracy of the portrait painted by Hoover's propaganda minions and those who have come along since. And that occurred, some of the old timers in the room are likely to remember this. In 1971, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Review the FBI conducted what the FBI, when it's doing to someone else, refers to as a black bag job. All right? That is to say, they burglarized the Media, Pennsylvania FBI resident agency. They broke into the office and they took hand carts, and they used the hand carts to transport the filing cabinets of the FBI agents who worked there out, put them in vans, and drove away into the night. They have never, incidentally, and you can applaud this one if you want, they have never, any of them, been identified or apprehended. Stoke the fires of imagination, draw a lesson from that, and figure out what you can do with the information. But do not expect me to commit sedition by telling you exactly what I meant by that, all right? This gives us a data sample. And the data sample consisted of the complete paper inventory of a representative FBI investigative office. And a breakdown of that paper came out as follows. 2% of the apportionment of resources in this run-of-the-mill backwater FBI agency went to the investigation of organized criminal activity. Another 15-odd% went to the investigative interstate theft of stolen cars. Another chunk of it had to do with routine administrative processing, bringing us up to about 30% of the whole. And the remainder had to do with the monitoring and suppression of the political activities of the citizens. Now, there's various forms of that. There was stuff on, well, in that period you had a lot of what we referred to as armed expropriation, bank robbery, but for political reasons occurring. They had a lot of paperwork on that, as if they expected a whole gaggle of revolutionary bank robbers to set up shop in a motel in downtown Media, Pennsylvania, and make themselves available to these agents whose career trajectories were not exactly promising, or they wouldn't have been in Media, Pennsylvania in the first place, you see. So maybe it would have been a pretty good place to hide out. Who knows? Maybe they needed the paperwork. But this was politically focused, although it was nominally criminal. Another big chunk of it had to do with draft resistors, their whereabouts. I mean, this was a catastrophically important problem for the whole country, no doubt. So about a third of their overall energy was chasing people around for not having voluntarily gone to the slaughter mills in Vietnam, or to participate in that anyway. And the rest of it had to do with monitoring students, clergy, PTA groups, a YMCA chapter, Another is thought to be engaged in politically objectionable activity. You have to tag that right there. Who's making the determination as to what is politically objectionable? Well, the Bureau was making that determination for itself. And basically the calculus works like this. If you were anywhere to the left of Attila the Hun, you were subject to FBI investigative activity. The further to the left of Attila you managed to get, the bigger your file became. And that was also when it was first made a matter of public awareness that there was something going on in the Bureau called COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO. Nobody knew what it meant at the time. People sort of trying to work it out as an anagram. What is this? The stuff that they're talking about in here looks kind of ugly, but what is this COINTELPRO thing? Well, it turns out it's usually referred to as a cryptonym because it was a secret program, and it was a contraction of the words counterintelligence program. Now, the FBI actually has a mandate to engage in counterintelligence activity, but that's not secret. The particular operations are conducted in a manner of secrecy, but the fact that there is a counterintelligence division in the FBI is no secret. It's actually got a budget allocation. It's relatively above board in that sense. It's perfectly well known that that exists, but that in its mandate is targeted on the agents of hostile foreign powers. Or in the case of a few like Israel, supposedly friendly foreign powers. You've got to kind of keep track of those guys too, or they'll steal your nuclear secrets if you're not busy slipping them to them anyway. So COINTELPRO, in its secrecy, was indeed a counterintelligence program, but it was a counterintelligence program of a different sort. This is the one that was mounted by the Bureau as a matter of systemic, centralized, controlled activity to suppress the activities, politically speaking, of American citizens themselves. And the reason it was secret is because that was flatly illegal, constitutionally prohibited activity. You see, when you're targeting saboteurs, spies, espionage rings, and so forth, the agents of hostile foreign powers, constitutional protections do not apply. The rule of the game in counterintelligence hasn't got a thing to do with investigation, providing evidence, bringing about a prosecution, and a sentence in prison as a punishment. It has to do with neutralizing the target. And you neutralize the target by whatever means, up to and including outright assassination, which has been done a number of times. No holds barred, bared knuckle kind of activity. You eliminate your opponent, you cause them to stop doing by whatever means are available and necessary to you. You cause them to stop doing whatever it is they're doing that made them the target of the counterintelligence probe in the first place. You understand? Well, if it's a Russian spy, it's not exactly like they're going to file an appeal. It's not exactly like they're going to file a suit either. It's sort of like the rules of the game. But now when you're dealing with U.S. citizens, supposedly your government cannot simply have your brains blown out because you're engaged in what it considers a politically objectionable activity. Political liberty, the advocacy of political ideals, even though they may be contrary to those of those in power, even though it may even be reprehensible to the general population, is a constitutionally protected activity. And the nature of COINTELPRO is that it was directed at suppressing anything outside the very narrowly drawn parameters of acceptability embraced by the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And as it turns out, this was not an especially new situation. The very fact of its duration and the fact that the FBI had all along apportioned its resources in a way comparable to that revealed at Media, Pennsylvania, indicated that the FBI had a function overall very different from law enforcement per se, or anything that could be arguably included under the overall rubric of law enforcement. Ultimately, it was an entity created right from the get-go, and I'm going to explain in a minute, even from before its get-go, to take the order of business as it encountered, business as usual, and preserve it. That the status quo, the structuration, socially, economically, and politically in the United States is such that there is a place assigned to everyone. at least by virtue of their membership in some rather arbitrarily defined groups. Groups like, oh, I don't know, blacks, Asians, South European immigrants, women, homosexuals, American Indians, Appalachian miners, and other poor whites. Name a group, there's a place. And the function of the Bureau is to make sure you stay in your place. And for people whose place is relatively privileged, that's a good thing. And that's who created the Bureau. For those who are not so privileged, and depending on the degree of lack of privilege, it becomes less and less a good thing. People who are not privileged in this social structuration tend, and the more the absence of privilege is available, the harder they tend, or the more they tend, to attempt to change the social structure and circumstance to better their lot. And that's what the FBI was created and developed and perfected to prevent. To prevent. Very different from what Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. purported to be doing on TV. Now, remember, as we go through this, that the place assigned to American Indians is to serve as resource colonies internal to the United States so that there can be extraction of strategic and commercially valuable minerals and other things fueling the American economy while existing in lives conveniently out of sight and mind of polite society as they quietly, or even not so quietly, there's not going to be anyone around to hear them, starve to death or freeze to death in the localities which they were consigned during the formation of the reservation period. That's the place. And that's what it was, the American Indian movement. Leonard Peltier, the resistors on Pine Ridge, and others elsewhere were bent upon changing.